It's my pleasure to introduce this event. Let me start by thanking our sponsors, Jones & Jones Management Group, and Crystal Dry is here to represent them. And a little industrial real estate company called Prologis. Lisa Reddy is here to represent them. So thank you for our sponsors. And Sonia Civilian, first of all, let's just thank Sonia Civilian because we should just do that. But she also told me that I have 5 minutes to speak, and she also knows I'm actually pretty good about sticking to that. Because I want to talk about why this is so important to USC, that we have events like this. First of all, for me, this is personal, and I know that the Lusk staff have heard this many times, and Clare has heard this, but there are a couple of things about real estate, which is something I love, that bother me, and one is the absence of women in the business. And I think about this I think about two things when I think about that. The first thing I think about is my mother, and we should all be thinking about our mothers a lot. My mother was a genuine pioneer. She was the first department chair at the university where she taught for about 40 years, which was the University of Wisconsin at La Crosse. She was the English department chair for about the last 15 years of her career. And so, being a pioneer, she overcame stuff that people who aren't pioneers don't have to overcome. Things were said about her that if she were a man would not have been said about her. Starting when she first got her job as an assistant professor, where apparently some people said to her, you know, you took that job away from a man who really needed it. That was the attitude at the time. And of course, the other thing about my mother, who most people who would know her would say is among the fairest people you will ever meet, but also a tough person. Well, women who are tough get sometimes a word attributed to them that if they were a man would just be called tough. And so I've sort of lived through the difficulties women who are trying to break into a field go through. But I'm extremely grateful to her because, one, she and my father both showed me the joy of working hard and working well. And it's something that's part of me, and I think it's part of their grandchildren now as well. And second, she taught me a certain kind of self-reliance that a lot of other boys weren't taught in the 1960s. Like I had to learn how to cook on my own, which is a skill that has stood me in good stead in a variety of contexts over the years since. And so I'm very proud of my mother, obviously, and it bothers me that women still have to be pioneers at breaking into certain businesses, and alas, real estate is, I think, one of those businesses. Second, when I go to my wife's events, my wife is a physician at UCLA, and yeah, don't boo, they have a really good medical school down there too. It's very striking to me. When I am her arm candy, I look at the room and it looks like America. What do I mean by that? It's probably like 55-45 men, women. It's not quite 50-50, but it's pretty close. And you also see every skin color, every ethnicity, every sexual orientation. Pretty much, it looks like the demographic makeup of America. The thing that makes them all unusual, of course, is they all got A's in organic chemistry, because that is the way you become a physician. It's not about who you know or what your dad built or anything like that. And this is a profession that 30 years ago was overwhelmingly a male profession. And now it is one that's getting close to parity. At the very top of the profession, if you're a medical school professor at the UCLA Medical School, you're actually pretty good at what you do, have gotten some recognition. And I want our business to be like her business. I want to be able to go to meetings and look out at the audience and say, this looks like America. Finally, I think it's very important as a business imperative for there to be more women and more people of color in the real estate business. The share of American households now that are a married man and a married woman where the man works and the woman stays at home and there are kids at home and that are white is less than 5% of households in the United States. Okay, so you're running a business whose job it is to serve everybody. A broader variety of perspectives might be helpful as you're trying to serve everybody in a business. And I think we need the perspectives of women. I think we need the perspectives of people of color in the executive suites of the real estate business in order to figure out, for example, how do we turn around the retail business, which, yes, is in serious trouble right now. I think in part because it's been marketing to a demographic that barely exists anymore in this country. And so beyond the fact that to me there's a personal imperative here, there's also a business imperative to making this change. So I'm proud to say here at USC, we now have 100 women pursuing real estate degrees in the Price School. You will be the next generation of, I'm going to say the next generation of middle management and then the generation after that of leadership, because I don't want to fool you into thinking you're going to be running anything when you're 32 years old. But when you're 50 years old, you all should be running stuff. We'll be coming to you asking for money when that happens, but don't worry, it's going to be a while. I think we have the deepest, richest curricula at both the undergraduate and master's level of any university in the country. I'm not just saying that. If you go to the websites of the other curricula, you'll see they're not as deep and rich as ours. And so we are training you well. And so there will be no excuse for the real estate industry not to be taking advantage of what you've learned here in the years to come. So we're very proud that you're all here. We're very proud at how well our undergraduate program has got it started. And thank you for participating in this lunch. So my next job is to introduce our moderator of a terrific panel, someone I've been spending a lot of time with lately, which is a great thing, Clare de Briere. Clare is currently the chair of the ULI Los Angeles District Channel. She's just founded a firm, C+C Ventures, for neighborhood development. She worked for the Ratkovich Company for many years. Okay, I was not. She is an MRED. And she is a fellow global trustee of mine for the Urban Land Institute. I'm going to let Clare introduce and run the panel. So Clare, thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. I love doing this. It's so much fun. It's even more fun for me to not be on the panel because there tends to be a dearth of women and the same ones end up sitting on every panel, so everybody has heard my story 1,000 times, and I'm so happy to let you guys hear other people's stories today. Just real quickly for the panel, how many of you have been in a meeting where you were the only female? So, and you, the rest of you, have you had that experience? So it is a very common experience. In fact, I think it was my entire first 5 years of my career that was the case, and it happens to this day more often than not. And I love the fact that you all are sitting in this room and you're going to be the makers of change, and it's not going to be like that for you, and I'm thrilled with that. Today we have 4 panelists. I'm going to start with Rose on the end. Rose is a senior vice president of the Related Company. She's one of our nation's best and biggest developers. Rose started as an architect and then turned into a developer, which doesn't always work, but apparently it worked really well for her because she got her MRED. I'm just going to give you a little plug for the program. And then next to her is Lindsay Garcia. Lindsay is the assistant vice president at U.S. Bank. She has a planning degree, undergrad from USC. And Jennifer McElyea is the managing director of Watt Industries. Watt has a very rich history here in Los Angeles and is now being run by the granddaughter of the original founder. And she's an amazing woman. She's also the chair of the board of Lusk, correct? No. She's on your board.
She is very important.
Sorry. So not to take away from you, but you have a great foundation of women in your company. And Jessica Palmquist, who is a senior analyst, so she's a numbers person for Clarion Partners, and she was a planning undergrad as well. So what we're going to do is have each of them basically tell us their story And we have a bunch of questions we're going to ask from up here and the conversation we're going to have, and then we're going to bring it back to you guys. So if there's anything that's said or that you're thinking about, have your questions ready, because this is as much about the conversation with all of you in this room as it is with the conversation with us at this room, or on this board. So why don't we start, Rose? I think you had sort of a fun transitional story.
Sure. I don't know how far back I should go, but yeah, I'm originally from Canada, but have spent the majority of my career down here in the States. And as Claire mentioned, I did architecture undergrad and, was on my way, following the dream of being an architect. And so I worked in Boston for a variety of different firms, doing mostly multifamily, some institutional, single family, combination different things. And, I always wanted to build things that, what drove me to become an architect was because I loved design, I loved architecture, I loved cities. That was kind of my passion. But, what I found as being an architect is when you get the project, a lot of decisions are already made. So like where the site is and what your role is going to be is a lot of the really big decisions are actually made before you get onto the project. So, after some thought and some thinking about, where do I want to go? I thought, real estate development, being a developer would be something that would allow me to sort of make get to decide where the building's going to go and what kind of building is it going to be. And you get to kind of have the bigger picture view. And that drove me to look at programs. And I came here and moved to LA in 2005 and did the MRED. And then since then have been working in real estate, mostly different types of residential, so multifamily, for rent, for sale, affordable, market rate. I did a recent stint up in Canada and then recently came back about a year ago. So that's it in a nutshell.
And Lindsay, why don't you go next?
Sure. Lindsay Garcia. I came to USC in 2007. I came straight out of high school, obviously, kind of knowing I wanted to go into real estate. However, I thought I wanted to be a real estate attorney. After a few classes, I decided that was not for me. But I realized how important finance is to real estate. So I started going that track, and I was here during the recession, so I wanted to get an internship. All the banks turned me away. Even unpaid interns were not wanted at that time. So I ended up staying and I got a progressive degree with planning through Price, and then was fortunate enough to find a job. I started right after college graduation, so about a week off. I started at US Bank, and I have been very fortunate to be able to grow there over the past 6 years, and am primarily a relationship manager right now. So we do construction lending.
So I sort of fell into real estate. I started in investment banking in New York, working for Deutsche Bank. And I was put in their real estate investment banking group and got a very great foundation in finance, but realized I liked the real estate component a lot better than just the pure lending and M&A work. And ended up becoming kind of the right-hand person for a senior person in our division. And this is kind of a theme that goes throughout my career, where what I did was just try and make his life a lot easier. And so he ultimately left and started his own fund, a real estate investing fund. And he said, hey, would you like to join me? And I said, okay, why not? So we started a new fund, and we became the US office for a number of banks out of the Middle East. And we invested their money in real estate. And it was a fantastic experience in the sense that I underwrote a giant volume of deals. I got to see a lot of transactions. I sharpened my finance skills. But ultimately, I said, I really want to be more involved in the front end of real estate. And by that, I mean, someone made a comment on one of our investments where they said, oh, you might be able to find some excess FAR on this. And I said, what is this FAR? I don't even know what that means. And I looked it up, and I'm like, oh, it's floor area ratio. This has to do with development. Where can I find out more about development? So I read about the MRED. And I made the decision to come across the country and do the degree here. This was 2005, same year as Rose. And it delivered in every way possible. What I really wanted to understand is land use and the entire process from here you have a piece of dirt, what can you build on it, how do you get it capitalized, et cetera, et cetera. So after MRED, I worked for a real estate investment fund called Apollo Real Estate, which had an LA office. They actually invested direct and with some operators. I worked for their direct investments, running all entitlements for a number of their LA-based development projects. They shut their office in the downturn. I ended up working at One West Bank when it was a distressed debt workout shop, where people would show up and give you a box of files and say, someone built this thing, we made a loan, figure it out, what's it worth? And I did that for a year. And then an old boss of mine, who I was previously the right hand to, called me and said, oh, I've moved over to the Watt companies. They're building out a new platform. Would you like to join? I said, oh, that sounds interesting. And I've been there 7 years since. So now I do a combination of kind of everything I ever did. I run their acquisitions portfolio for any new development and investment we do in real estate.
Hello, Jessie. So I graduated from USC undergrad in 2010. How I ended up in the Price School, I came in wanting to be a publicist, so I was in Annenberg. I very quickly realized I didn't really like writing. I much preferred math, and I took a class through my business minor over in the business school, and it was a real estate finance class, and I just felt like everything was making sense, why people make all their decisions in life. It all kind of came back down to the finance principles. And so I took a class. I'm like, oh, let me try, back then it was PPD. And so let's take a class through there. And real estate it really immediately made sense to me. It was finance, but it was finance that you could touch and you can see, and it made sense why people live their lives the way they do. Why do we build retail centers the way they are? Because people like to shop a certain way. And so while I was at USC, I had a small internship, and they ended up offering me a job right out of college. But more importantly, I met Richard Pink, who used to be the head of Clarion's office here in LA, where I work now. I met him through one of the advanced finance courses in my undergrad program, and I was very, very fortunate. He would come in as sort of an adjunct speaker, and we would make presentations to him. He was acting as an investment committee member, for example. And I guess I didn't look like a total idiot, even though it's amazing to me how much I didn't know at that time. But so I've been working at the small company for about 9 months after graduating, and he called me up out of the blue one day and said, hey, we have an analyst job in our acquisitions department. Would you like to come interview? Long story short, I got that job and worked in the acquisition department for the first 4 years I was with Clarion. And we did all property types, all risk profiles, just, up until the point where we bought the property. And after doing that for a while, and being, the number cruncher only, I was kind of ready for a change and was lucky to be able to, grow at Clarion and move over into the asset management department where I've been for the last 2 years. And now just focusing on office asset management, primarily in LA and the Bay Area now, but really West Coast. So yeah, that's my story.
And Jennifer, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned two people that were role models or mentors for you. How many mentors have you had? Do you keep them over the years? How do you find them? Did you ask for mentorship? Did it happen organically? Just give a little talk about that, because I think that's an important thing for everybody to hear.
So I mentioned the right hand thing. I think that's one category of mentorship where I would find somebody that I worked with or for, and just would try and make their life easier. And if there was something that I could take on that would allow them to elevate, that is much appreciated. And I always felt, real estate's obviously a people business, and there's a lot of teams within the business, and people are very loyal to teams that work. And I have found that on the teams where I really got a connection with somebody, I mean, they've looked out for me my whole career. And so there's a number of relationships like that where those were developed just by working together. Then there were also mentorship relationships where there's an attorney who I met when I was just networking for a job. When Apollo shut their LA office, I started setting up meetings with anybody I'd worked with that had touched real estate, and one of them was a real estate attorney. And I had lunch with him, and he started introducing me to other people that I might want to meet with. And that was 10 years ago now, and he continues to do that now with other relationships, or here's a deal you might want to look at. He is like a confidant for me. And it was just kind of building that relationship over time. Finally, I'll say there's a woman, I'll give her public credit. Her name's Martha Shelley, and she works for ARA in Glendale, and she was my boss at One West Bank, and she was actually the first woman I had worked for ever. When I started at Deutsche Bank, I was one of the first analyst class that had women in it entirely. I mean, there were no women, and there were no women role models. I mean, in real estate, I feel like there aren't very many women in senior positions. So I had no one to go to for mentorship in that regard. And I was quite scared because it sort of felt like an environment where, well, only one of us will get to the top. So we're not going to help each other out. And the great thing about Martha was that she was the opposite, no sharp elbows. She was very much like, you can do this. We can work together. And it wasn't like an us versus them. And she had that balance. I think Richard mentioned, you know, a tough guy can be a tough guy, but a tough woman can get a different name applied to her. And she was able to navigate that where she was tough. She stood her ground. If she defended an investment, you know, it wasn't in an emotional way or it wasn't in a, you know, difficult way. And I really admired that. And she helped give me confidence that I could hang, you know, with the guys and I didn't have to change how I was. And I really appreciated that. And she was one of the few people that, you know, was a number of years ahead of me. So I've kept in touch with her as well.
That's great. And then let's talk a little bit about the idea of internships because both Lindsay and Jessica, you talked about having internships. What kind of a role was that? Did you sort of figure out something that hit home? You're like, oh, this is what I want to do, or was it like, oh dear God, this is not what I want to do? I mean, how did that work for you guys?
Well, so when I was doing the master's in planning, I had internships with cities, and I just wasn't in love with that. So I guess in the long run, it was a great experience because I learned how to deal with that for the set amount of time I was doing the internship. And I had a couple different internships with cities. One in particular, it was just miserable. The people who were working there were not pleasant to work with. And so much about having a job is enjoying the people you work with. To have a career, you spend a lot of time with the people you're working with. And so if you don't trust them and they don't trust you, or your personalities and the culture don't jive with yourself, you're just not going to be happy. So those internships were a very good experience for what I didn't want to do. But then I actually started at US Bank as an intern because, like I said, I graduated as we were coming out of the recession. So they gave me essentially like a 6-week internship kind of to test me out. That way, you know, if they didn't like me, they could let me go. But they kept me. So that was a great experience because in the long run, it was kind of nice for myself as well. I finally had the experience in the real estate finance where I thought I wanted to be, and it solidified that was where I wanted to be.
And you talk a little bit about transition. I know, Rose, you actually went to school, got a degree, and practiced architecture, and had that moment of, oh dear God, this is not what I want to do. Just I had almost the exact same thing happen to me as well. So how did you make such a risky decision to take a job and take a career that you had that you were succeeding in and put the brakes on it. It sounds like, Jennifer, you kind of did the same thing when you came out here and went to grad school. How did you make that decision? How did you do the risk assessment? Was it scary? Who did you go to for advice? Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a while ago now. Yeah, no, I mean, I was somewhat torn because it's not like I didn't like what I was doing. So, I mean, I loved architecture. I loved the people I was working with. And, you know, it's very much also a team-based kind of office. And, you know, you really liked the people I was with. So it was more about, you know, one, the pay is terrible, you know, in architecture. So that was a factor, was just, you know, this is great, but it's long hours and, you know, there's no daylight at the end of the tunnel in terms of ever being able to support yourself financially. So I think it was, you know, and it's also, let's say I was around 30 at the time. It's sort of like, well, you know, if I'm going to go back to school, do a graduate degree, it kind of made sense in terms of where I was. It was, yeah, I mean, it was, I think the thinking of it in terms of, well, if I want to switch careers and I'm going to use grad school as the way to do it, that was kind of the way I rationed my way, you know, thought through it. And you get this window of time where you get to be a student again, which I was kind of looking forward to. And so it was very much about, okay, real estate. Okay, now I'm going to look at the programs. You know, and I think it's definitely a process because you have to look at, you know, what's the right fit in terms of, you know, what does the program have to offer? You know, where is it going to be? You know, I was living in Boston, but I wasn't necessarily going to stay there. And, you know, I was fortunate because you know, my current husband I met in undergrad and I've now been with for like 20 years. So he and I were going through this together. So I was not kind of alone in my journey. And so I think that, you know, and he was also looking at grad schools and he went to UCLA. So, I mean, having a partner through that, I think helped, and having, you know, it made it more complicated because we had to end up in the same city ideally. But that was the way, you know, I wasn't in it alone. So it was, you know, daunting, but, you know, I was lucky that I had someone kind of going through the process too.
One of the things you raised was pay. And there was a horrible, I mean, extremely well-written and well-researched, but horrible article about the fact that women still make significantly less than men in the same positions, and that if a job description has a list of 10 qualifications, women will go, gosh, I only have 9 of these 10, I can't apply for the job, versus a man would look at it and go like, hey, I got number 1, I'm good, and just go for it because he can figure it out. And one of the things that benefited me when I was early in my career was I started in the last big recession, and all the senior people were being fired. They had to be let go because the company was getting smaller and smaller. And the president kept saying, does anybody know how to do, you know, net present value analysis? Now, I was a history major. I had no idea how to do that. But I went, this is before the internet. This is a long time ago. So I went to the library, checked out a book, figured out how to do it, came in the next day and said, I can do it. I'll do it. I can do it. Let's try. So one of the things that, and I think, Lindsay, you have a story about this, that we as women tend not to do is ask for raises and go after promotions. And maybe if each of you can talk, I know, Lindsay, you have a great story about the raise asking, but maybe each of you can take a step on, like, how did you make the transition from just being analyst to asset management? Did you ask for it? Did somebody offer it to you? And, you know, each of you maybe talk about that, but let's start with Lindsay.
Okay, so I have been with my company for 6 years, and about a year ago, headhunters through LinkedIn connect all the time. And up until that point, I had been very happy with my current employer. But in 2016, I felt like I needed to grow more, and there didn't appear to be a lot of future growth. So I felt like I was hitting my ceiling. So I interviewed with a few companies, and I received a great offer letter. But there was just something, I listened to my gut. There was something about it. I was hesitant about making that move. I don't know if it was just partially because it was a little bit of a shift from the commercial real estate to kind of smaller clients. And I deal with larger institutional type clients. I also enjoyed working with everyone, but I decided to take a risk and at least give US Bank the chance to match that offer. And I thought about it for a really long time, but I felt like I had a backup. So there was a risk that US Bank might just say, here's the door. But they actually came back, and I think because I was strategic in when I had asked for raises. So throughout the first 2 years, I didn't ask for raises. I started asking for raises as my role grew, and I obviously felt like I deserved it. So I didn't want to come off feeling entitled. But I think that it is important because in the long run, it's been the best decision to stay with US Bank. There's been changes and so much more career growth. And that ceiling, they completely shifted my position to something where I see so much longevity with US Bank.
So you got the raise.
I got the raise and almost a brand new position.
Oh, that's great.
So yeah.
And actually, let's go to you, Jessie.
Sure. Yeah, so I've actually a very similar story for when I made the switch from acquisitions to asset management. I had, like I said, been with Clarion for 4 years, and I was, I loved acquisitions. It's very exciting. It's very sexy. It's a very great department to be in. But I wanted to do something different, and I wanted specifically to do asset management. I had met with a number of the asset managers at Clarion and had grown very close to them, and I was like, hey, this field I think requires a lot of the characteristics that I think are my strengths. And so, similar to Lindsay, I, started kind of looking through the LinkedIns and, all the different real estate job posting sites and in the hopes that I would be able to pursue asset management if it wasn't going to be at Clarion. I, saw a job that at a competitor of ours in the asset management department, applied for it and got the job. This very luckily happened to be during, bonus and review time. And so, I was able, and like Lindsay said, I was ready, I was prepared to go. And move companies if I wasn't in the near term able to make the switch. I think what was important is that I had been, in terms of being able to make the switch at my firm, is that I'd been with the company for, at that time, 4 years. So it wasn't like I was asking something after being there, for a year or even 2 years. What they said really was, hey, you've done your time and we want you to stay at the company. We think you're valuable enough. And so we'll make the switch, and we will bear an inconvenience in doing that so that you will stay. And yeah, that's basically how I got into the asset management department at Clarion. I'll say one quick thing on raises. I found that also, and being at a larger company like myself, it's always a push and pull. You always want to get paid more, and companies always want to pay you as little as you can to stay. I found you should always be pushing and asking because it's very unnatural, I think, as a woman to ask. And I have found that all of my male counterparts, exactly my same age, will always ask. And sometimes I'll look at it and think, gosh, I think I do a better job than they do, but maybe I didn't get a raise because I didn't ask. Yeah. And so that's a huge facet that just doesn't come naturally to me, maybe a lot of women, but
and I have to say,
ask.
After having been the chief operating officer of the company, I was the one getting asked. And I don't think any of my female development managers ever asked me for a raise. Mm-hmm. I was just looking at, the end of the year and doing bonuses and raises, and all the guys would come and been like, hey, by the way, did you see that deal I closed for you? Did you see that lease I signed? Like, I think the recognition should come. And none of my female development managers were like, I'm just doing my job. That's my job, is to lease his space and make sure you're as profitable as possible and make sure we meet budgets. And I was like, you guys, come on. Do you want a 5% raise? You want a 10% raise? If you ask for it, you'll get 10. So asking.
Gets the grease.
Yeah. So asking is really important. You guys have both had good experiences. Jen, you were nodding. Did you?
Oh, I'm laughing because I'm like, that's totally me. You know, I'm like, oh, I'm doing my job. Like, performing well is like the standard, right? Yeah. Like, exactly. It shouldn't be like I'm getting a bonus because I did what you asked me to do. But I guess one anecdote I would share that is a lesson learned is I think I was always cautious because I'm like, well, you know, at some point I want to have kids and like I don't want to ruffle any feathers or like, you know, it's going to be tough already asking to take time off to go on maternity leave and gosh, if I'm asking for more money, like that's just gonna be make that ask even harder. And I think that was a mistake. I've now had 2 children while at this company, and I regret not asking for more, because it really, I took, excuse me, with both kids, I took 4 months off, and 4 months is like that. I mean, I was so paranoid that like so much is gonna happen while I'm gone, and I run the group, so I was like, it's gonna go crazy. Everyone's gonna lose respect for me, and like, it's gonna be chaos. And I need to be there, and they're gonna hire someone to replace me. And it was really a non-issue. And I was just, you know, telling myself that I needed to do the kind of like stay low profile in order to not make it difficult for me to disappear to do what is totally normal to do. So that was a lesson learned. I try to be much more aggressive now with the ask.
You brought up something that we also want to talk about today, which is sort of 2 sides of this. One is the idea of the work-life balance. As women, we have to do something that men will never have to do, and that is to be pregnant and give birth to children if we so choose. Some of us have dogs, I'm just saying. Much easier on the body. So as much as men can help and are part of that process and deserve paternity leave, there's a physical side to what you're doing. So for 9 months, or for say 6 out of the 9 months, everybody knows you're pregnant. Like, and then there's this presumption, oh, is she going to come back? And this whole idea. So there, particularly in such a male-dominated industry, that is not necessarily the most comfortable role to be in. And I think in some cases, when we do what Jen did, which is think, oh, I'm not going to ask for this, or I'm not going to try to go after that job because I'm going to want to be able to have kids within a year or within 2 years. And so you don't realize the elasticity of what your job actually is and how easy it is to go and to, you know, to leave and to come back and to make those relationships work if you're part of a team, which is what most companies are. And this, I'm going to let whoever wants to answer it. What was the hardest part about making the decision? What's the hardest part today? Having kids or not having kids, or getting married or not getting married? And then the flip side of that is, unlike, as Richard says, he goes to events twice a year with his spouse and gets to be arm candy. I have events in real estate 3 times a week. I mean, there is something. We have closing dinners, we have ULI, we have all these different things that we do in real estate that you don't necessarily have to do in other industries. And that is a social side of it that is also and there's also some unique things about being in a male-dominated industry, one of the only women who are at these dinners, or one of 2 women who are at these dinners. And, you know, how do you, you know, be one of the guys and drink with the guys and go out with the guys and yet still be not one of the guys and be respected. And so there's a very fine line between those 2 components of our life. So who wants to take that?
Yeah, I can take a stab. I mean, all this is sort of, it's funny, you sort of laugh and all this rings true. And I mean, I was sort of older when I had kids. I mean, I waited a while. So I sort of, you know, I had the career as an architect, and I did the MRED, and then I worked for a while after doing the MRED. And then, you know, you do start to have, you just have to sort of bite the bullet at a certain point when, you know, and you have to sort of say, look, I'm going to have kids because I'm not getting any younger. I was lucky to have kids. I was working at a sort of smaller nonprofit, so you know, their sort of mission and values were very much sort of pro-woman, and you know, it was just it was nice to have that setting where it was, you know, not necessarily seen as a negative to go have kids. But that being said, I was still like you, Jen, the exact same mentality. I'm like, oh, the guy they hired to cover while I'm gone, he's going to take my job. And I was paranoid for at least a year. And I came back and I was just, you sort of lose your mind, I think. So you do. And you're
the lack of sleep.
Yeah, you're a zombie. You don't think straight. And you look back and you're like, wow, I was just nuts. But now that I have kids and I work full time, my husband works, I definitely, the networking part of it is almost now for me, it's almost impossible because it's, my work takes up a lot of time. And then, the rest of the time I have is for my family. So like evening events are really hard. Breakfast events are almost impossible. So lunches I can do because it's during the workday. So, I would always be like, why don't they do more lunches? Lunches, people, lunches. So that's my advice is more lunches, But I definitely see the difference. And even my male coworkers who have kids, they'll be like, oh yeah, I went to the city council meeting and I'm on this, and I'm like, I just, maybe it's a choice, right? So I could do more, but it's already this kind of push-pull between, how many evenings am I not going to be around and not be there for dinner? And, they go to bed and then they're like, you weren't there yesterday. And you're like, it's true. I wasn't there. So yeah, I mean, I would love to do more stuff. And, and I'm like, well, when they're in college and I'll be closer to retirement, then I'll do a lot of networking then. But yeah, it's, there's no easy answers.
Right,
but
you need to do the networking like right before you're about to retire.
I'm on it. Yeah. So, but I think because I had, the nice thing about having kids later is that you figured a lot of stuff out. And, I was far enough in my career that I was high enough on the food chain that it was harder for me to, companies still wanted to have me around. So you have to, it's like knowing your own value. And I think that they're not going to just like kick you out the door. You're hard to replace, it's expensive to replace good employees. So, but now I know the stuff now, but 10 years ago, I didn't know that.
Jen?
I would agree, the exact same thing. I'm like, the reason I'm here is because it's at lunch. Like, if this were like a night panel, I'd be like, sorry, I can't be here. But
Lunch is good.
In all seriousness, I agree. Know your value. I mean, I had my first child at 33, and I was at least in a position where I was like, okay, if they're not going to value me as an employee here, then this is not some place where I want to be for the long duration anyways. I mean, there's always that risk, but I really felt like, thankfully I was in a point in my career where I felt like, okay, they need me here. They're going to take me back. And I wasn't gone that long. I'll address a couple other things maybe for kind of the younger people in the audience. When I first started in the business and I was single and before I got married, there is a lot of social component to it. And as I got older, I'll start with just, there are certain events where there's like ski trips and golfing outings and whatnot. And there's a balance between how you show up to these events, particularly if there's alcohol involved. And so you want to be fun and you want to get to know everybody, and guys bond over these events and they can act silly and not really have repercussions, but the repercussions for women are slightly different, where people may not take you as seriously after the event if you behave just as goofy as the guys did. So it's kind of a double standard, and that's something you always have to think about. And it's not fair, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. When I got married, to Claire's point, my husband was kind of like, "Gosh, you have a lot of these like one-on-one things with guys. Like, you'll be in a meeting and you'll meet somebody, and they're like, oh, well, let's grab a drink after work and we'll talk about the deal." And it's totally innocuous, but there's a lot of it, and that's how stuff gets done. And even kind of getting my husband comfortable with that was a thing. And I could see where he would be uncomfortable because there's a lot of social elements to it. I'm trying to hit all your points here.
You're doing a good job.
What did I miss? And the other thing I'll say, trying to plan when you're 20 about when you're going to have your kids is just like very difficult. I'll tell you, I was like, oh, we'll get married, we'll have kids X. And then when you think you want to have kids, like it takes a while, So even when you think the time is opportune, like your body may not agree with that. So there's so many elements that factor into it. I think it's really about getting confidence in where you are and ending up in a place where you feel valued. And again, becoming that like really rock for, whoever you work for and becoming their like key person. That's what's going to get you through any type of break that you take. And I'll add, at one point I said I was so burnt out, I need a sabbatical. And everybody was like, no one is going to agree to that. That is so crazy. There's no precedent for it. And I laid out my case. This was one time I was aggressive in my ask. And I got it. And it is amazing, what people will do for employees that they value. So.
And with you two, you don't have...
Just a dog. I'm very, and I've had that experience too because it is weird. There's so many after work events and dinners, and my husband's always asking, where are you going? Who are these people? And especially when I started, it was primarily middle-aged men that I'm going to dinner with. It's a weird scenario. But I mean, there's, it's true. Like there's golf tournaments, and I hated golf. I'm not patient, like, oh my gosh. But what I've learned is that the golf tournaments you can be a part of that are scramble because you play the best ball. So just go to the driving range, practice.
Or go to the dinner afterwards and skip the golf.
That's there you go.
Again, things you learn. There was I tell this story, when I started at my company, I've never been a sports person ever. I'm terrible at all things athletic. And I wasn't real. I'm like, I love the Dodgers. and I apologize for everybody in this room. I love the Bruins, but I'm not a sports person. And, all the guys would sit around at lunch and talk sports. So I started reading the sports section of the LA Times cover to cover. Now I can memorize anything. So they would all be talking about baseball, and I'd be like, yeah, did you guys see that so-and-so hit a 400 and blah, blah. And I had no idea what I was saying, but they're like, oh yeah, that's right. And then that would start a conversation. And then all of a sudden you're part of that conversation, which isn't right that I had to do that. And this one again was, almost 30 years ago when I was just starting in this business. But there are things from a social standpoint that I think we've all had to do to engage and again sort of become one of the pack. And in doing that, you're both opening the door to being able to say, hey, look, this is, I don't have my glasses on, so I can't actually see how much that is. Oh, thank you. All right. So, so you end up like having to make these compromises, but you open the door to get to the point where you can say to them, hey, look, let's talk about this deal. Let's talk about these numbers. Let's do this. And all of a sudden it equalizes you a little bit. So, Lindsay's exactly right. Practice your golf swing, go on the fishing trip, but maybe you do the fishing trip or the skiing trip and not or a golf trip or whatever, anyway. Okay, we're going to go to Q&A now, which that was the sign that was held up. But before I do that, I want to ask those of you in this room, and I know we hit a lot of points and there's a lot of conversation, but for those of you here, how many of you wish that more of your male counterparts were here hearing this? To understand it better? And then of those of you who are raising your hands, how many of you would be willing to have these conversations with your either student friends who are guys or people that you're working with? Would you be willing to have these conversations and talk about this and talk about some of these things that make it harder to do what you're doing? I only see one hand. Okay, 2 hands. All right, that's 3. So it's, something like we have to take responsibility for some of this too and not suffer in silence.
I'm a mother of 2 boys, and I've been a single mom for a long time, and it has derailed my career. And I didn't have kids till later, 40 and 43. Now they're teenagers. But I just wanted to ask, what was your support system, and how did you make it work for you? Did you have to give up? What did you have to give up, if anything?
A lot of sleep. Most of my sleep. So, yeah. I've never had family nearby, so that was always really hard. Because I think if you can have kids and have relatives nearby, it's a good thing. So, yeah, because it was basically my husband and I, and We relied on each other a lot, and you have to spend a lot of time looking for good childcare. And I was lucky enough to pay for childcare, and that's, again, it's like I was at a stage where I could afford to pay for childcare. And if I had, that's a very difficult thing, right? Because without the childcare, I couldn't go back to work, and I had twins, so I had to, pay twice, which is hard. So yeah, I mean, you do have to think about it, and you definitely will think there's no way I can do this. I think I spent like 5 years in my late 20s and early 30s just thinking, well, there's no way I'm having a kid because I can't pay for it. It's not happening. And you find a way. This is one of these things that you find ways to make it work. But yeah, I mean, I think, I think it's what's harder is you do have to be picky more about what you can and can't do. You have commitments beyond the workplace. You would maybe like to do more of these things, extracurricular and networking things that you can't do. It's an extra level of difficulty on top of just regular life, right? Is that, and when you move jobs and you move to a new city or any of those things, you now have to think about, okay, I'm not moving, all these people are moving with me, and I need to figure out how are they going to be cared for, and, so it just puts this extra level of difficulty. Now, that being said, I think, we talk a lot about this as being sort of like a problem for women. I think for men who are married or men who have kids, who may or may not be married, or gay couples, anybody who has kids, it's an issue for people who work and have kids. It's not about women, it's about parents. And I think the men have just as many concerns about childcare and schedules. It's just they don't talk about it as being kind of an issue. But yeah, I mean, my coworkers who have young kids, and most of which are guys, they're like, why can't, the daycare closes at 5? I gotta go, And so it's becoming better. It is getting better.
There's an interesting conversation I had yesterday with a woman who works at Douglas Emmett, and she was saying that her boss wants to physically see you or her in the office. And I said, my former boss and partner used to want to do that too. And he wanted everybody in the office at 8, and he wanted to see his whole team. And little by little, we ended up getting in there and saying, look, so-and-so isn't going to start work physically in the office until 10. So you can get her on the phone from, 7:30 in the morning until 9:59. Right before she walks in the door, she'll be emailing, she'll be doing her thing, but she has to be home to take her kids to school and, oh, thank you, you're much closer now, be able to take her kids to school and pack lunches and do what she needs to do, and she needs the morning time for that. And my thought was, as long as the work is getting done, then why not do that? And I think those are maybe some of the conversations to have with, an old school company that wants to see you in the office, and versus being able to very efficiently do your job, maybe by taking a little extra time in the morning and working with your phone or on your laptop. Are there groups that are good for women's groups in real estate that are good for helping you on your career path? I'm going to make a plug for one in just 1 second, but why don't you guys answer that?
Sure. Yeah. I'm not. It doesn't have an official name, but I am part of a group of women who meet quarterly for lunch, and all real estate women professionals, and it's been a huge resource for me, just because there aren't as many women in the office. But yeah, it's definitely a resource. And
that's actually a really good point to make. There's this whole idea behind like making your own tribe, and there's a group. I have a similar thing where there's this group of women that we meet, I think, twice a year. But and we always make sure that it's our core group, and we always bring 1 or 2 younger people in to like bring up the group. And but I know ULI has a women leadership initiative, which this is the plug I'm going to make. There is a networking program that ULI is doing that's $15 for students. It's called Mastering Networking, and it's part of WLI, which is the Women's Leadership Initiative, which is a group within the Urban Land Institute. And that event is October 10th, and it's talking about how to sort of manage and meet people during the fall meeting, but it's also to your point, women helping meet women to figure out how to do that in a comfortable way and how to create partnerships and things along those lines. Any other groups that you all belong to?
I'm not in a formal women's group. I have a similar friend circle of women in real estate. But I would say that for me, most helpful has been my classmates from MRED. I have a standing lunch with them once a month, and they might be men, but we deal with the same, from a professional standpoint, we deal with the same issues, and I find that going through the program together with them created such a bond that, we look out for each other, we trade information, and I value them equally to my women friendships. There's obviously different discussions, different issues, but it's nice to know that there is a support network that you can create that doesn't just have to be 100% women as well.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. I actually had a question for you, Claire. How did you make the transition and why?
Transition from what to what?
From the 26 years to starting with your own.
Well, my couple things. I was turning 50, which, trust me, is a very overwhelming thing. And it makes you think about the fact that you're like, oh my God, I literally have half my life lived. Now what am I going to do? And I had that moment of realizing that I had worked for the same company for 26 years. And so that was one part of it. And I was like, gosh, that's more than half my life that I've spent at the same company. What else can I do? The second thing was all of our projects were in great shape. They'd either been recapitalized or sold. I had built a fantastic team of people. So everything was in really good hands. And I wanted to go back and have fun. Like sorry, you guys, I hate what I'm about to say, but being a chief operating officer of a growing, large, complex company is a lot of bureaucratic paperwork, not fun stuff. Like my previous position, which was the director of, or VP of development, senior VP of development, that running the development side of it, that was great. But running the whole company is not that much fun. And I kind of wanted to go back to doing deals and having fun. And so, and after you work for 26 years, you should be able to do that. But it was fun. I mean, it was like, let's go. And that's sort of the other thing is how much do you love your jobs? Do you love what you do every day?
Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And you love the people you work with?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that's that's sort of the overwhelming thing. As you build your teams and you really find your place, it makes these life-career balance issues a lot easier to manage, and the social side of it a lot easier to manage. Because then if I say to Jen, look, I know you don't like doing nighttime things, but I really need you for this one thing, then you know that she's got your back and she knows that you've got her back. And that's the kind of sort of team building that we all need to really think about doing. And it sounds like you all have done that tremendously well.
Hi, I just want to thank you guys all for being here. My name is Liana. So on the topic of balance, I just had a question for all of you here, actually on the panel, and for you, Claire. What would you tell yourself? You know, the act of balancing is something really hard, obviously, as a woman and for having a career. What would you tell yourself 10 years ago in regards to, you know, balancing all aspects of your life as a woman and as a career woman?
All right, one sentence answers, starting with Rose.
Nothing's ever going to be perfect.
Excellent. Lindsay?
Can we do better than Rose?
I know.
Give or take.
That's a good one.
You won't always finish everything on a given day.
That's really good too.
Worry less.
And I would say have fun every day. Like, don't worry about the crappy stuff because it's always going to be there. Look for ways to make your days joyful.
I have a question about explicit exclusion and what you do when you're facing it. I was recently on an informational interview with an alumni, and he was telling me about how great the bachelor party was, bachelor weekend. They went fishing, talking deals the whole time. You know, I don't want to say, oh, that's great, I will never go to a bachelor weekend. That's and then I'm 34, and I've noticed socially, I initially had equal guy friends and girlfriends, and as people have gotten married and gotten older, I'm not invited to boy happy hour anymore from friends that I've had a long time. I mean, it is an explicit exclusion, and I was just wondering if you have any tips as you're facing it on how you deal with it.
So on the, I'll do a quick one and then let you guys answer. On the bachelor party one, you never will be invited to the bachelor parties, so you just have to let that go. But on the boy happy hour, pick up the phone and call your guy friends and be like, dude, why am I not going anymore? I'm going to meet you guys on Thursday night because I know you're going to be down at Library Bar, and what, when are you going to be there? And there's no reason not to invite yourself, not to have that conversation. If these are your friends, engage with them, have the conversation. Maybe they just assume that you have other things that you need to be doing because all their other, girlfriends are, busy doing other things. So I would say don't ever or invite them. Say, hey, I'm meeting a bunch of people over at so-and-so for happy hour. I'd love for you to come, and just shoot an email out. They don't need to know that you're that's the first person you're asking, So make those opportunities for yourself. Do you guys have any thoughts?
I think women as a whole, we're more sensitive. So you might be almost excluding yourself. So like you said, just go. That's half the battle.
But I will say it happens. I mean, I was lamenting to a colleague the other day where 9 times out of 10, if I have a breakfast meeting with a bunch of guys, we have to talk about the waves and the surf conditions. And I'm like, I used to surf too. I can actually contribute to this conversation. But like no one even, they're like, Jen's like, whatever. And I'm like, if I have to have another 20-minute surf conversation, I'm going to freak out. But, I think that's also a little bit part of the culture of how the guys chat with each other. And like you said, with the sports scores or whatever, you try and work with it as best you can. And, there were now kids, but before they'd have what they called board meetings and they'd go out and surf together. And every so often I'd show up and, participate. And it wasn't my favorite thing in the world to do, but you kind of, that is the culture that the majority of the people in the business, subscribe to, and you try and kind of work your way into it.
Well, and if you, using the golf example, if you actually are a good golfer and you're on those best ball, games and people find out that you're a good golfer, then you get to really get invited to a lot of things that way. All right. Well, I want to thank all of our amazing panelists and Sonia and Richard for caring enough to, you used to be over there, caring enough to create events like this and to raise your women up and make them feel like they are part of this business, which they are. So thank you both very much, and thank all of you for coming. This is great.